Of the conference report and would like to revise and extend my remarks at this point in the record.
Without objection. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the remaining time on this side to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Leath.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes. For unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent to have inserted after my remarks previously the text of a letter received from Secretary Weinberger on gas warfare. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, members of the House, as is always the case when you don't have very much or anything to defend your position with, you fly off in a rhetorical storm. And as is always the case, unfortunately, when we discuss chemical weapons in this House, we can expect a great deal of that rhetoric, because there are no facts to back up the positions of the people who don't want us to modernize our chemical arsenal. Yet this House, Mr. Speaker, cannot be guilty of making a rhetorical, emotional decision. We must make this important decision based on fact, based on need, based on reality, and based on the historical evidence of proof. The truth is there is absolutely no relationship between the emotional rhetoric we've heard and the hard, cold facts of reality. If members want to get emotional about something over the binary issue, Mr. Speaker, why don't they get emotional about our soldiers whose lives we are jeopardizing with this policy of hope and wishing? History records very graphically that the military doctrine which recognizes that the way to keep chemical weapons from being used is for there to be a comparable threat in chemical weapons on both sides. That's a sound doctrine, and it's proven by history. Most of this debate, Mr. Speaker, through all of these hours, has been on the horrors of chemical weapons. But that's not the issue. Of course chemical weapons are horrible, but all the ranting and the raving and the gnashing of teeth is not going to eliminate these horrible weapons from the arsenal of a heinous enemy. The issue here is not whether the world would be better off without chemical weapons. Of course it would be better off without them. But we can't wish those weapons away, no matter how hopeful we might be. The issue here is not whether we in the United States are willing to ban and unilaterally destroy these heinous weapons. Of course we are. We've done that and proved it conclusively over a period of 14 years. The issue here is not, are we going to suddenly out of the blue amass a new arsenal of a new weapon? Absolutely not. We've had chemical weapons since the early 1900s, and precisely because we had that arsenal of chemical weapons, Mr. Speaker, that they were never used since World War I. To think that you can wish the Soviets into agreement by standing on the high ground and waving morality at them is absolutely utter nonsense. Unlike us, they've never given something away in return for nothing, and they're not about to start now. When we strip away the rhetoric, Mr. Speaker, the issues are really quite obvious. How do we protect our troops against the 80,000 troops that the Soviets have trained in chemical warfare, the 30,000 vehicles that they have for a chemical environment, the 14 plants that they have that are turning out 10 tons of new chemical agent every year, that they have a 500-kilometer range and have stated unequivocally that it's in their discretion of their battalion commander to use chemical weapons, and they're actually using those weapons around the world today. The issue is, however, how do we convince a belligerent government to ban chemical weapons? Do we do it by continuing a policy of unilateral disarmament that we've had for 14 years? Has that worked? No, it hasn't worked. And the opponents of this vital modernization have not given one single solitary reason why finally, after 14 years, it's going to work now. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is, are we willing to lower the nuclear threshold by denying our forces a comparable chemical warfare threat, forcing our commanders no viable alternative short of nuclear war? How foolish can we be, and what a senseless gamble this House would take. But there is a way, Mr. Speaker, to speak to all of these issues. There's a way to make the Soviets bargain in good faith, not down the bankrupt path of continuing decay and disarmament of the last 14 years, but by rebuilding the comparability so necessary to deter these weapons.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman as well.
I thank the gentleman. Just as we did in World War II, and by destroying the highly toxic and dangerous 40-year-old stock and replacing those toxic stocks with transportable, modern, deliverable weapons. But then, Mr. Speaker, we're even willing then to give them another 2.5 years, another 5 negotiating sessions. It's been said over and over again that we hold the moral high ground on this issue. Well, perhaps that's true. It's my opinion you wouldn't have to stand very high morally to hold the moral high ground against the Soviets. But while we stand on the moral high ground with our backs turned and our heads bowed, the Soviet butchers are gassing hundreds of thousands of innocent people in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Lord knows where else. Do you really believe that men who are capable of gassing millions of innocent people and shooting down an unarmed passenger plane with one of your colleagues on board it gives a damn about morality? Are you willing to tell this House and the American people today that we can trust people like that? As Chairman Mr. Pepper said yesterday in the debate on the resolution, how do you deal with a human being that's devoid of conscience? How can you stand here and try to sell that argument when that argument went in smoke, up in smoke when 007 went down? You're not going to shame the Soviets into an agreement. They will be forced into an agreement. That's the only way they'll do it. And the only thing to be accomplished with these senseless, baseless delays is to prolong the Soviet Holocaust and to threaten our own security in the process. Now, perhaps your conscience can stand that. Mine can't. Your way hasn't worked in 14 years, and we've just had dramatic world proof that it's not about to work today. I have here a communication from Ambassador Louis Fields that said he made less progress in this last session than he had ever made. And why? Because the Soviet Union is watching this debate. They know what's being said on this floor. They know that we don't have the backbone, or at least some of us don't, to do what needs to be done to force them to reach a meaningful agreement. So are we going to do, as some members said yesterday, send a brilliant 416-0 message to them that doesn't mean a cotton-picking thing? Or are we going to approve the fact that we're going to modernize every defense force that we have, from the conventional right on up through the strategic nuclear, and say, yes, we'll sit down and talk with you? We want to destroy every one of them. But we have learned rather graphically, the whole world has learned, that we will not be able to accomplish that if we roll over and say we're going to depend on the great moral fiber of Mr. Andropov and his Soviet henchmen to keep us from having the Holocaust of a nuclear war, or to keep us from having the total destruction of our conventional forces with a chemical agent that they can destroy NATO in a matter of hours. So I ask my colleagues, support this conference report, and that'll be the message.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I move the previous question.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The questions on the